Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our opening plenary session, day one of the Trade and Sustainability Hub. Lovely to see you all. Please feel free to turn your video cameras on. We would love to see you. We will ask that everyone remains muted during the session unless you're a speaker, but still it would be amazing to see you. Zoom can handle it. So if your bandwidth can handle it, we'd love to see you. Feel free to turn your video cameras on. And if you'd like to say a hello, we will be beginning, as you can see on the timer, in just a minute or so. So feel free, you can introduce yourself in the chat as well. But yes, welcome, and we'll be getting started in just 1 minute. 1 minute. Those of you who have just joined, we're going to be starting right now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Bernasconi, and I'm the Executive Director of IISD Europe. I'm enormously pleased to welcome you all to this opening session of the Trade and Sustainability Hub. With this hub, we wanted to provide a space for voices with different perspectives on trade and sustainable development, alongside the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference. We were all taken by surprise when the Ministerial Conference was postponed last minute on Friday due to new developments around COVID-19 pandemic. The response to a yet new variant of the virus has once again disrupted what we used to take for granted, coming together face-to-face, crossing borders, and trying to find solutions together as an international community. The extra time gained until the conference actually takes place will hopefully allow countries to advance on issues such as access to medical products, fisheries, and agriculture. Together with our core partners, CUTS International and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, we hope that this hub will contribute to advancing these negotiation items, but also hope to spur broader thinking around important issues that are not currently on the negotiating agenda. Due to the ongoing pandemic, the hub will be held completely in virtual format. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the in-person feature of the hub, which would have allowed participants in Geneva to meet in person, to network and exchange. Once we have more definitive information on new dates for MC12, we will do our best to provide a physical networking and meeting space, and we will keep you posted on this. But for now, we are simply very excited to be hosting over 30 discussion sessions with over 50 partners over the next 3 days. These sessions were selected after an extensive curation phase to ensure covering a wide range of issues and views at the intersection of trade and sustainability. A big thank you to all of our partners for engaging in this hub. We also would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for the generous support provided for our work on trade in general, or this hub in particular. And I would like to here thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the United Kingdom, the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and the Pew Charitable Trusts. And now we are thrilled to kick off this hub with an opening plenary, which is jointly organized by IISD, Queen's University, and the Australia National University. The theme of this session is the multilateral trade regime in contending narratives about economic globalization. The session is inspired by the recent book published by our two colleagues present here today, Anthea Roberts and Nicholas Lamp, on 6 Faces of Globalization. The authors explore who wins, who loses, and why it matters. At IISD, we thought it would brilliantly help set the stage for the hub discussions over the 3 coming days. We think that discussing and understanding different narratives, different positions on globalization, understanding the underlying conflicting values and disagreements will help foster a more collaborative and holistic thinking and approach to negotiations and global policy making. Many thanks to Nicholas and Anthea for collaborating with us in organizing this opening plenary. And now I would like to hand the floor to Nicholas Lamp as the moderator of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you for having us. And congratulations to you and your team for putting together this really fantastic program with over 30 sessions. We're really looking forward to it. I want to start today, introduce the session by going back 6 years to December 2015, the Nairobi Ministerial. And I think doing this is helpful in 3 ways. First, 2015 was the last time that the WTO members concluded a multilateral instrument of legal significance, namely the ministerial decision on export competition. It is also the point in time at which the US called openly for the first time for the Uruguay round to be shelved. And so it really marks a turning point in the system, because at that point we couldn't really say that we were pursuing the Doha round in a serious manner anymore. But the third point that's really interesting about that moment in time is that if we look at the debates that were happening between WTO members at the time, they seem incredibly narrow from today's perspective. They were about market access and agricultural subsidies and the exchange rate between commitments given by developed countries and emerging economies. And so even though we had the emergence of the big developing countries as a major issue, it was a very narrow issue. It was really seen through the prism of the traditional negotiating remit of the WTO, subsidies and market access. So at that turning point, we couldn't really foresee what would happen in the next couple of years, but I think nobody really predicted that what we would see in the following years would be this immense backlash against economic globalization, or at least against a specific form of economic globalization in the West. And one thing that this backlash has done, it has radically expanded the subject matters that trade and trade negotiations seem to be dealing with. And so the topic for today's session is really to ask, well, what does all this mean for the multilateral system? How can the multilateral system accommodate the explosion of narratives that we've seen since 2015, 2016? And so what we want to do today in this session is we want to start out with the Western backlash, because that's really where I think we have seen the most development since 2015. Then we're going to look at perspectives from outside the West, in particular from India, from Africa, both on economic globalization and on the role of the trade regime. And finally, we are trying to tie it back to the trade regime and ask this question, well, what do these new perspectives mean for multilateral trade lawmaking? So I'm delighted to welcome our speakers today. I'm not going to introduce them. They're going to be introduced in the chat, and I'm happy to hand it over to Anthea Roberts.
Great. So thank you very much for hosting us here today. We're really delighted to have a chance to present this. As Nicholas said, I'm just going to start by introducing what we see as the dominant Western narratives in these debates, and others will follow with narratives from elsewhere in the world. And this really comes from a book that we've published recently with Harvard University Press called 6 Faces of Globalization. And to take from Nicholas's opening introduction, I think he takes you to the end of 2015. For us, this book in many ways began in 2016 when we saw the Donald Trump's election, we saw the Brexit vote. And that was really, I think, at the moment where there was a real crystallization of the feeling of a pushback against economic globalization. And suddenly we've been sort of trade and investment lawyers in the field for 20 years, like many others on this call have been. And suddenly we found that our particular areas were very hotly contested, and hotly contested in political debates and in the public newspapers. And there was a sort of a cacophony of arguments going around about what was wrong with economic globalization. And at the time, it seemed so confusing to us that there were all these sort of arguments about whether, Mexican workers had taken American workers' jobs, or whether China was going to dominate the world, or whether we were all in problems because of climate change, that I remember at the time saying to Nicholas, it reminded us a little bit of a sort of scrambled Rubik's Cube, where it was hard to make heads and tails of what was actually happening. And so what we wanted to do as a first step was to ask ourselves, would there be a way to sort of unscramble the cacophony of narratives that we found in the public debates, to try to understand in a more coherent way what the main narratives were that were pushing back against economic globalization and how they related to each other. And the reason that we chose particularly to look at narratives was we felt that at the time, many people who wanted to defend the trading regime and the status quo were very quick to say, but what about the facts, and like test this and test this. But our sense was that there were some very strong, not just different perceptions of the facts, but different values that were being embodied by these narratives. And that the first step we wanted to do is try to understand what those different perspectives were. So when we unscrambled this Rubik's Cube of narratives, this is what we found. In our 6 Faces of Globalization, we start with what we call the establishment narrative. Now, the establishment narrative was really the dominant narrative for several decades, particularly after the Cold War period. And this is the narrative that we were used to. It's the win-win understanding of economic globalization. And what we basically say here is it's the understanding that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter if you're developed or developing, that everybody wins from economic globalization. And that's because it was considered to be a rising tide that lifts all boats, or a growing of the pie so that everyone got a bigger slice. Now, this establishment narrative, and the reason we call it the establishment narrative, is that it was often a relatively strong position of left and right across many countries. But it was also the narrative that I think was strongly embodied by many international organizations, WTO, OECD, IMF, World Bank. Now, it wasn't that there weren't any concerns about this, and there were certainly some protests about this at an earlier stage, but there was a general sense that this was generally a good for all, and it led to absolute benefits around the globe. And we represent that here by the blue lines pointing upwards in terms of everyone gaining from economic globalization. Now, this particular narrative tended to do 2 different things that we just want to highlight. The first is it sort of said everybody wins in the aggregate, but we're going to try to enlarge the size of the pie at the international level, and then we'll leave redistribution of the pie to the domestic level. That's a separate game that can happen separately. And the second thing is it said, look, there may be some people who in the short term are losers from economic globalization because their job has been lost. But what they really need to do is adjust, that globalization is an unstoppable force like technology, and you just need to adjust, and ultimately everyone will be better off. So what we found with the pushback against economic globalization was that this particular narrative really got unseated as the dominant narrative, and multiple other narratives came into view. So the first one I want to highlight is what we call the left-wing populist narrative. And this is a narrative that's particularly concerned about inequality. This narrative takes issue with that premise from the establishment narrative that what is important is to grow the size of the pie and then you can leave redistribution to the domestic level, because it says that redistribution has not been happening. And so what this left-wing populist narrative basically focuses on, it doesn't necessarily say that the blue lines are wrong, that there hasn't been in absolute terms a growth for most people from economic globalization. But instead of focusing on absolute gains, it focuses on relative gains. And that's what we depict here with the red lines. And what it basically says is that a disproportionate amount of the benefits in these periods of high globalization have been captured by the elite. And the elite is defined in different ways. Some people say top 20%, some people say top 10, top 1, top 0.1. But the idea is that the elite has disproportionately gained, and that has hollowed out the middle class. And it's often left the lower socioeconomic classes to be entirely precarious. And so this is the first one that kind of takes issue with the establishment narrative. And it's one that you would see back in 2016 through people like Bernie Sanders, more recently Elizabeth Warren, AOC in the American debates. Now that's a different narrative to what we see represented by what we call the right-wing populist narrative. And this one's embodied by people like Trump. And instead of thinking that the problem was that the relative gains were disproportionately captured by the elite, they say, no, this is actually one where the relative gains were disproportionately captured by workers in other states. And so here we get this very strong sense that workers in the developed countries, and particularly those in manufacturing towns and manufacturing industries and industries like steel, have lost out because their good working class jobs have been shipped offshore to workers who then became middle class in India, in Mexico, in China. And so here, one of the ways that we try to represent this with the idea about relative gains is instead of this being kind of a vertical hostility about concern about gains going upwardly to the elite, this one is more of a horizontal hostility between countries as sort of a rivalry which is the idea, and you would hear this from Trump a lot, that China and Mexico had been ripping off the United States and ripping out these communities and leaving them behind. And this is strongly supported by other evidence about deaths of despair in these communities and what's often called the ruination of these manufacturing areas. Now, this kind of horizontal interstate rivalry is a little bit similar and a little bit different to what we call the geoeconomic narrative. So whereas the populist, right-wing populist narrative tended to look at particular communities that got left behind, and they were often the working class or the manufacturing communities, what we see in the geoeconomic narrative is that instead of focusing on particular communities, it tends to focus on countries as a whole, and in particular on the great power rivalry between China and the United States. And here the argument is that China and the United States, in absolute terms, may both have won as a result of economic globalization. But during this period of high globalization, China narrowed the economic gap with the United States, narrowed the technological gap, narrowed the military gap. And what that means is that it disproportionately gained at the expense of the United States. And this is the one that you are starting to see now in recent years, and it's very strong in US policy, but also in some of the other Western states, which is a very strong concern about geostrategy, a very strong concern about security. And here we start to see interdependence not being seen as a driver of growth and a driver of opportunity, but a source of vulnerability and a real concern about interdependence being weaponized in various ways. It's also one where you can start to see a bit of a difference with the protectionist narrative. So the protectionist narrative is often very concerned with jobs of the past and jobs about traditional values and traditional communities and sort of a feeling of a bygone era. Whereas what you see in the geoeconomic narrative is a very strong focus on technological advance and who's going to dominate the future industries, 5G, AI, quantum computing. And this links very much to the economic security is national security. Now, if we're going to think about those sort of technology companies, I guess one of the other ones we should mention then is the corporate power narrative. And the corporate power narrative has a longer tradition. We saw this kind of narrative before in the Battle of Seattle, which was a real concern that what actually happens with trade negotiations is it doesn't mean that workers in Mexico or China benefit at the expense of US workers. What it collectively means is that the power of labor has been weakened as we have these big multinational companies that are able to, in the global space, move their ability to produce anywhere that they want in the world, to trade anywhere and sell into any markets they want in the world. So they lower their costs, they grow their markets. And yet at the same stage, they've been able to hop, skip and jump around the world to avoid things like taxation up until recently, particularly when they're dealing with IP rights. And so this is one that really sort of sees that like all workers might lose out as a consequence of economic globalization, and that it's actually transnational capital that might be the big one that's got the advantage. And they've got the advantage potentially not just against domestic workers, but also in their ability to play themselves off against regulatory regimes from different states and create potentially a race to the bottom. The final narrative that we want to highlight here, and this one has become incredibly salient in the last year or so, is what we call the global threats narrative. And you'll notice in this particular narrative, it's the first time that we've put the blue arrows going down, because the premise of this narrative, it says it's not about whether you're growing the size of the pie, and it's also not about how you're distributing the size of the pie necessarily. What we've done at the moment with our relentless focus on economic growth is that we have put ourselves on an unsustainable path, a collision course with our planet. And we need to fundamentally reorient our economies in order to make sure that we all survive and thrive within the limits of our planet. And this global threats narrative is one that we see very strongly in talks about climate change and the need to completely change the way we do our economies. But also over the course of writing this book, it's one that we've seen very clearly with the pandemic, which is that this is a global threat. We're all in this together. And actually things like the pandemic, they would say, has been both exacerbated by the physical transfers of people in economic globalization, but also the supply chain shocks that we saw as a result of the shutdowns. And so this global threats narrative tends to give rise to arguments about needing greater resilience on the one hand and greater sustainability on the other hand. And that if we don't do that, we're all at risk of losing from unstoppable economic growth. Now, I said to you at the start, we had thought about this as unscrambling a Rubik's Cube. So the way that we think about this when we unscramble our Rubik's Cube is on the top of our cube, we have what we think of as the win-win analysis, which is everybody wins from economic globalization. The middle level, the four sides of the cube, we have what we think of as the win-lose arguments, which basically says economic globalization produces winners and losers, but it has different ideas about who wins and who loses and why that matters. And if you turn the cube over, what you find on the bottom is a real concern that if we don't change our approach, we're in a lose-lose situation. Some people might lose first, some people might lose worse, but we're all going to be at risk of losing from our current approach to economic globalization. Now, I say that these are common narratives in the Western debates, and I hope that these are familiar to you. For example, I think it's pretty clear that we've got covers of magazines like The Economist that give you that very positive establishment story about the rise of economic globalization. We really do see that left-wing populist concern about the rise of the rich. We see the right-wing populist concern about communities being left behind. It's incredibly difficult to miss US-China rivalry going on at the moment. There's an increasing concern about corporations and winner-takes-all markets, particularly in the digital space. And finally, we're increasingly seeing with both climate change and pandemics, this sense that we're all in the line of fire. But I should say, and I'll pass to other speakers who can give perspectives from elsewhere around the globe, that one of the things about a Rubik's Cube is that you feel you've solved it once you've unscrambled it. But for us, unscrambling the Rubik's Cube is just the beginning. Because if we want to think about how we might move forward, I don't think that we're going to see any one of these sides dominant as a single phase. In fact, I think going forward, what we're going to see is what we think of as kaleidoscopic complexity, which is how are we going to mix and match the Rubik's Cube to multiple sides. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Anthea, for providing us with the Western perspective. We're now turning to Abhijit Das for the perspective from India.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. At the outset, I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for inviting me to this session to share my thoughts. In the context of trade and globalization, for India, 1991 marks a watershed. This was the year when the country implemented a comprehensive set of measures that marked an important shift from the country's previous inward-looking trade policies. Without going into the details of the reform measures that were undertaken, suffice it to say that they considerably deepened India's integration into the global economy. The point to note is that these reforms were driven mainly by internal imperatives confronting the country. With the exception of a handful of few, there is a broad consensus among scholars and other stakeholders that the 1991 reforms have resulted in considerable economic gains for the country. In more recent years, jobs created in India on account of exports of IT services have provided another positive stroke to perceptions about trade and globalization in India. Having said that, where does the problem lie? The problem is not with globalization per se. Rather, it has much to do with the rules at the erstwhile GATT and the WTO, as well as how the negotiations are undertaken for writing the rules and how the multilateral trading system itself has functioned. Let me highlight 5 dimensions of perceptions in India regarding globalization. First and foremost, the rules of the multilateral trading system are viewed by many as constricting the policy space of governments in developing countries, including India, to pursue policies for creating domestic jobs and generating incomes. Let's remind ourselves that most of the advanced industrial countries have built their economies by selectively protecting and promoting some of their industries until they were strong enough to compete with foreign firms. However, after the domestic producers acquired financial heft, the developed countries prohibited through the GATT and subsequently the WTO agreements They prohibited developing countries from implementing similar measures. This phenomena, so eloquently described by the Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang as kicking away the ladder, is significantly responsible for a bit of a negative perception about globalization and trade agreements in India. Second, the multilateral trading regime, as enshrined in the rules of GATT and WTO, have often been depicted as a rules-based system. Again, the perception of many in India is that while the developing countries have to strictly adhere to the rules of the game, this does not hold true for developed countries. Two examples are often cited to illustrate this power-based behavior of the developed countries. The 1995 waiver, which allowed the United States to heavily subsidize its farm production, and the discriminatory textile quotas imposed by the developed countries on developing countries for almost 45 years. Although both these actions in agriculture and textiles hurt the trade interests of many developing countries, they had little option other than acquiescing into the GATT inconsistent action of the developed countries. Third, the asymmetries and imbalances contained in some of the agreements at the WTO, particularly the agreement on agriculture, have also contributed to the negative perception about trade and globalization and the multilateral trading system. No doubt, developing countries have secured special and differential treatment under the agreement on agriculture, but the perception in India remains fairly strong that the agreement on agriculture is lopsided in favor of the developed countries. Provisions regarding AMS entitlements, special safeguards readily come to mind in this regard. The short point is that the developed countries have negotiated provisions that are essentially slanted to promote their commercial interests. Effectively, these are reverse SNDT provisions in their favor. Fourth, and a very fundamental point here, whose interests prevail in multilateral trade negotiations? The process of negotiations itself is perceived to be loaded against the interests of a vast majority of developing countries. The non-transparent manner in which ministerial meetings are organized and conducted, the active use of raw power by developed countries at the negotiating table, particularly during ministerial conferences, definitely tilt the system against the interests of many developing countries. Another problematic aspect is the role of chairs of various committees and negotiating groups. While chairs are required to reflect consensus or different positions on various issues if consensus hasn't arisen, at crucial junctures, some chairs have failed to adhere to this very basic rule of fair play. They have prepared documents that have overwhelmingly reflected the positions of developed countries while almost completely ignoring views of the vast majority of developing countries. The message that emerges is rather unmistakable. The negotiating process accords primacy to the interests of the developed countries. In the recent context, the tardy progress made on the proposal by South Africa, India, and 62 other developing countries on TRIPS waiver is another reminder of how interests of developing countries tend to get a bit marginalized in the negotiations. Fifth and final point, the one-sided discourse on international trade and WTO issues in the international media has also contributed somewhat to the negative perception about trade and globalization in India. The international media gives rather extensive coverage to the point of view articulated by the developed countries. On the other hand, the reality as perceived by some developing countries often gets lost in this battle of perception. I think it's important to give one example in this context. After the Cancun Ministerial Conference collapsed in 2003, Bob Zoellick, the then USTR's binary of can do and won't do countries, became the leitmotif in media reports on WTO negotiations. Not only was this characterization by the USTR perhaps inaccurate and unfair, it was also an attempt to deflect attention from USA's own role in triggering the collapse of the ministerial meeting. I'm not saying this. Drawing upon the recollection of Pascal Lamy's spokesperson when Cancun failed, Paul Bluestein in his remarkable book hints that in 2003, the US allowed the Cancun conference to collapse on the so-called Singapore issues. The EU officials suspected that the US prevented being blamed for Cancun ministerial conference if discussions had progress to cotton subsidies, an issue of considerable political difficulty for the United States. Clearly, the narrative in the mainstream media about collapse of the Cancun ministerial conference continues to remain can do and won't do countries, a one-sided depiction based on what Bob Zoellick said after the ministerial meeting collapsed. In conclusion, let me quote Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. I quote, "Globalization itself is neither good nor bad. It has the power to do enormous good. And for the countries of East Asia who have embraced globalization under their own terms, at their own pace, it has been an enormous benefit in spite of the setback of the 1997 crisis. But in much of the world, it has not brought comparable benefits," quotes closed. This seems to capture what might perhaps be wrong with globalization and why it faces protests in developing countries. I will stop at that, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your very kind attention.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Just a reminder, please mute your microphones. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Bettina Gappa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues, the Trade Hub, and it's such a wonderful opportunity for us here from the AFCFTA Secretariat to take part in this side event at the now cancelled ministerial. And I'm delighted to listen to Abhijit. I've read so much of what you've written. It's such a pleasure to share this panel with you, Natalie, Anthea, Nicola, everyone. Joost, lovely to see you again. When I was a child, I think it was about 1987 or so, there was a kid who became famous at our primary school in Zimbabwe, Alfred Byte School, for having solved the Rubik's Cube. And what he simply did was to stick and unstick everything together. And he presented this Rubik's Cube that was sort of like touchily stuck together and said, see, I've solved it. So there may be some shortcuts, but of course, shortcuts are not what we're talking about. I'm very happy to follow up on Abhijit's incredible presentation by sharing with you just some perspectives from the African continent, African perspectives on globalization, on inclusivity. And I'll start by saying that there is an increased disenchantment with the WTO. And there's a questioning of what Anthea and Nicholas in their terrific book calls the establishment narrative. This idea of the trickle-down effects of globalization, that globalization tends to benefit all countries equally and all countries at all levels of development. Now, we keep talking about the Doha Round, but perhaps it's important to remind ourselves that its full name is the Doha Development Round. It was supposed to be the round that anchors development into the WTO, but it has been crushingly disappointing from that perspective because it has been characterized by lassitude, by complacency, by atrophy even. And there has been failures on products of significant importance to African countries like cotton. One of the last cases I did at the ACWL when I worked in Geneva was the US cotton subsidy case. And just the idea of representing Benin, which was, acting not even as a main party, but as a third party, the voice of African farmers, West African farmers, who were pitching themselves against global behemoths like Monsanto and others. You know, it was a David and Goliath fight for which the WTO was supposed to, you know, eventually resolve this with rules of fairness around, you know, what is excessive subsidization and so on. But it just didn't happen. And for years, the farmers from West Africa continued to benefit from, you know, to suffer from depressed world prices, while they're more, you know, competitive. Competitors really were benefiting from subsidization. So this is just one example of just how unfair it has been for West African farmers. Even when there's a WTO ruling in their favor, they still can't get implementation. And the COVID pandemic has done two things for Africa. I'll come back to the second thing in a minute. But one of the first things that is done is to really spotlight the unfairness of the world's economic order. First of all, as Abhijit said, you know, the refusal to grant patent waivers to allow us to develop the capacity to manufacture these vaccines ourselves, the stockpiling of vaccines, which Gordon Brown recently called it's one of the biggest shames of international relations in recent years. And then to add insult to injury, the refusal to certify, you know, where countries have been forced to take on these vaccinations, you know, Western vaccines, the refusal to certify their programs so that people can travel, you know, having been fully vaccinated. No, you still have to travel as though you are unvaccinated, even though you're vaccinated with a Western vaccine and so on. So there's just been such fundamental unfairness with respect to how the Western nations have responded to Africa in the context of this pandemic. And then recently we had the Glasgow summit, the climate change. And African countries are being lectured to and hectored and constrained when it is a fact that we are by no means the biggest contributors to carbon emissions. We are by no means the biggest, you know, we're not the most prolific of the emitters. And yet Africa is put on the spotlight again and again, most recently by Prince William, who talked about, you know, the size of African families when his own family, frankly, there's a bigger carbon footprint than your average 50 African families, you know. And I'm highlighting the problems of unfairness in the globalized world economic system. But what is the African solution? You know, a few years ago, Professor John Jackson, the father of international trade law, came to the appellate body where I was working at the WTO. And he had this warning, you know, we had you know, he used to come and talk to the young lawyers and just, you know, pick our brains and would pick his brains. And he had this very prescient warning about what would happen if the disenchantment with multilateralism set in. He said, countries will simply focus regionally. Countries will simply focus on FTAs. In other words, countries will look at those areas where they can control. And to quote Stiglitz, as Professor Das, you know, reminded us, countries will look at how they can, you know, advance globalization on their own terms and at their own pace. And this is what Africa has decided to do. This is what Africa is doing. We have embarked on a program that is really an idea of its time. And the more I look at what's been happening in the world, the more I realize Kwame Nkrumah was right, that economic independence has to go hand in hand with political independence. And he understood that a single market for Africa was the only bulwark against imperialism. And this is where we are now. We are creating in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, a free trade area, a single market for the entire African continent based on the work of the regional economic communities, SADC, ECOWAS, EAC, CEMAC, and so on. We are building a continent-wide single market because it is absolutely shameful that in 2021, Africa continues to orient its trade towards the West, towards outside. Africa continues to trade under the GSP. Joost can explain very well to you, better than I can, that the GSP is not a legal regime in the sense that, you know, preferences are not guaranteed, it's a gift. And as we saw with India and Pakistan in the GSP case, you can be included or excluded for foreign policy reasons, right? So you cannot base an entire trade policy just on preferences. So what we are trying to do with the AFCFTA is to link trade policy to industrialization, recognizing that we can't all be trading bananas with each other. You know, we can't be sending raw materials to each other. We have them. So only if we industrialize can we actually achieve the single market that is so necessary to improve the current levels of African trade. I will give you, I will stop here because I would like to say a little bit more about what we're doing, but I'll just leave you with a small statistic, which is quite sobering actually. Africa contributes 3% to global trade. And much of it is raw materials under preferences, right? Singapore, which just, you know, used to be a little fishing enclave, Singapore contributes 6%, right? So a continent, 3%, Singapore, 6%. And if you then look within that 3%, only 18% of trade is in the African continent itself, which is an anomaly because Europe is about what, 59%, Asia is about 69%. We are the only continent that doesn't trade with itself. And that is why for us, the solution to this global disenchantment, to this global inequity, to this failure of globalization to take into account the need for inclusivity, the solution can only come from within, and we can only undertake globalization on our own terms and at our own pace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bettina. We now turn to Joost with the considerable challenge of trying to distill some implications for the trade regime.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good day, everyone. It's an honor to be on this opening panel. Thanks also to the IISD. It's great to see so many old friends, and Bettina I haven't seen for a long while, but none of your fire has gone. So I'm really delighted to hear you speak. So the organizers asked me to draw some lessons for the multilateral trade regime. And I think it's very important from my perspective, as Professor Das was saying, I think we need to distinguish between globalization and the backlash against it, the trade regime, and then the WTO specifically. I think those are three different elements. And as a general point, I would add that from my perspective, and some people have referred to this as the globalization backlash paradox. We often speak about trade migration when we talk about the globalization backlash, where the costs and benefits are doubted. From my perspective, I think financial globalization, free movement of capital is way less discussed, but the benefits of that are more questionable. And I think the impact, the negative impact is more outspoken, but yet we never really talk about capital movements as a potential cause of this backlash, because it's less visible. We cannot really pinpoint it. Now, in my couple of minutes, I'd like to do four things. One is to take you back to the moment of creation, 1994, a couple of points on what has happened 30 years later, so the state of play today, and then some ideas on what to do and how we could do it. And then I'll end with a heretic idea just to shock people and turn the floor back. Now, taking you back to the moment of creation, like many of you, the 1990s is when I graduated from law school. I came into the professional world, and looking back, it was just such a very different moment. And I think my own students now, they don't realize what it meant, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Washington Consensus. If now we are talking about competing narratives and diversity, at that moment, there was like unbelievable consensus. It was the end of history, remember. So this is what we need to think of when we try to understand the WTO. So the Tokyo codes were put aside and everything was made uniform. They even included a provision saying you need to have consensus of everyone to add a plurilateral, which is now backfiring big time. So the moment of creation was one of consensus view as to, how does the world function and what do we all have to do? And today I often think, what on earth were these people thinking? How could they ever believe that there would be this consensus and that diversity would be gone? But in many ways, that's what we are now stuck with, and that we have to deal with. So my second point, 30 years later, of course, history is back with a vengeance, and all the narratives that were explained show this. And I'm delighted that Professor Das Bettina added to the complexity. We have more diversity than ever. I mean, in 30 years, the world has turned upside down, right? So secondly, this idea of multilateralism and all coming together and kind of being altruistic, it's completely gone. I mean, everyone now negotiates from the national interest, which I'm not criticizing. In many ways, it's kind of natural. As Bettina was saying, we need to do it the African way, look at how we can benefit from the system. I completely get it. But the reality is that we've moved from a consensus world to a fragmented world where everyone thinks about their own national interest, which of course makes finding agreement on anything incredibly difficult. Now, in terms of the backlash, I mean, of course, we can talk of the many narratives, but for me, it's a double whammy in many ways. When I started working in this field, it was very much the critique that Professor Das was summarizing, and that we've heard for many years. The developing world felt unfairly treated. And in the early years, you had developing countries upset with the WTO, perhaps some Western green NGOs. But the last 5 or 10 years, the second level of critique that got added is the Brexit critique, the Trump critique. So now we are kind of ambushing this regime, this organization from two sides. And honestly, I have no idea how they can ever get out of this double whammy. Third point, what to do. I think one approach is, and I've been very intrigued by this, but I don't know whether it will work, is to find a new common narrative, right? That kind of brings the 164 together. The EU has tried to do this. In their February 2021 trade policy strategy paper, they put forward as the common narrative sustainable development, right? I don't know whether it will work. It sounds like a very Western idea, the sustainable angle to it. People reminded us of it, that development is probably a different narrative, but the EU has put forward sustainable development as the common narrative. You may have seen in US proposals, the common narrative is one of, look, the WTO needs to have some common market principles that we all share. And of course, the underlying critique is China doesn't meet those, so there's a problem. I'm sure if we ask India, South Africa for a common narrative, they would take us back to what was mentioned, development. We have forgotten development, and we haven't dealt with that yet. So as tempting as it may be to find a common narrative moving forward, I think it will be very hard to get one. And I doubted that it's worth spending political capital trying to define it. Which leads me to an alternative, which is to really take a step back and see the multilateral trading regime as a negotiating forum, as a transactional forum, a clearinghouse. I mean, Bettina mentioned it. We need to focus bilaterally, regionally, get our own house in order. And from that perspective, you could think of the WTO as a place where you get together to strike deals that benefit everyone. And let this idea of, you know, a deal needs to be in our national interest, let that be the guiding lodestar. Because if you think of it, and someone mentioned John Jackson, I will never forget what Bob Hudick, another trade luminary, was saying. Look, you can legalize all you want, you can set up architecture, but none of these deals will stick if people don't believe that a rule, an agreement really benefits themselves, if it's not in the national interest. You can do all you want if that's not achieved. So I know it's kind of very minimalistic, but I think that's probably what we need to get back to. A clearinghouse where we strike deals, where everyone is happy with the deal. And it could be trade concessions, but it could also be multilaterally beneficial rules where everyone is happy with them. And I know that needs to, the way you then approach deal making could be somewhat different. And you try to move away from the ideological narratives in the past and just try to strike deals that benefit everyone. Now, my last point, how to do this. Because we mentioned this in our early discussions. If you focus on the WTO, it's tempting to say, look, they can't agree on anything. Nothing is possible. Forget about it. And yet you see a few months ago, 137 countries agreed on a massive global tax reform in the OECD, including the main WTO players. And yet in Glasgow, of course, they didn't solve the problem, but they reached important agreements to tackle climate change. So how come at the WTO, even the smallest agreement seems to be so difficult? I would offer two suggestions on how to do it. One is to be way more evidence-based, to really discuss issues based on the facts, gather evidence first and then discuss. Why evidence? So that everyone knows, okay, how will this impact me? Too often, I think people follow old narratives in the WTO, they hold old grudges, they take ideological positions, they play diplomatic games rather than sitting down, looking at the facts, gathering the facts on e-commerce, gathering the facts on fisheries, on how dispute settlement has actually worked, rather than having ideological debates about them. And I think fact gathering, evidence-based policy making ex ante, but also ex post, like we've struck a deal. What has the impact of that deal been on my economy, for my people? And if it was positive, okay, we continue. If it isn't, to change it, rather than to strike a deal and then live with it for the next 30 years. So one is evidence-based, and I may be influenced by the OECD there, but that's very much their starting point always. Second point is looking at how these other deals were struck. I think we need to widen the group of stakeholders involved in the WTO. And Natalie has mentioned this as well. To be honest, like many of you here on this panel, we've been in this field for 20 years and we've more or less had the same discussions for 20 years and nothing much has changed. So it's very much a bubble we are all in, trade diplomats, a few think tanks, a few universities, a couple of law firms. I don't think we will get out of it talking to each other. I think we need to broaden it up to capital-based experts. I mean, by the way, a couple of weeks ago, the TBT committee found agreement on a 40-page implementation review of the TBT agreement. No one talks about it, but this is massive. It's really big. Why? Because those are technical experts who know the facts and actually realize, look, this agreement works for all of us. Bring in the expert back. Secondly, make it more politically salient. Bring the ministers in. I mean, we haven't had ministers for what, 4 years? And thirdly, most importantly, we need to bring business and civil society in. I mean, just having diplomats talk to each other, you fall back into ideological debates and you don't bring stuff on the agenda that is salient. People, honestly, I was telling my friends, MC12 has been canceled. What a disaster. Most of them were telling me, look, no one really cares in the real world about this, right? You Joost, with your WTO law knowledge, I mean, it's like being able to speak Hochdeutsch in Switzerland. I mean, it's a fancy, nice thing you can do, but what's the real value in the real world? So to be honest, the action is in Brussels, is in Washington, is in where Bettina is sitting, not in Geneva. So let's bring in business, let's bring in civil society. I think that's what made Glasgow move, not the governments, but the NGOs and honestly the companies. Now, I'll end with my heretical idea. Often I get so depressed about how this can ever be unblocked that I want to think out of the box, right? Because everyone is so set into their narratives, as you were saying, Anthea, that in the WTO, I just don't see how they will get out of it. Now, perhaps this is a good moment to have a new constitutional moment. I mean, we went from the ITO to the GATT to the WTO. The reality today is you can't exclude members from the WTO, nor can you do anything without consensus. The only thing you can do very efficiently is to withdraw from the WTO. And 6 months you're out. What if we set up a new organization, right? and we make a transition from the old WTO to whatever you call it, the ITO, whatever you want to call it, but you create a new operating mechanism along the lines of what I was mentioning, and then you find a critical mass for countries to join an organization that will function. And you let it operate on this transactional basis so that you can really do business again that matters to the world. I know it's kind of a crazy idea, but I think at some point, I wonder what's the point trying to operate, do things within the organization that is completely stuck. The only way out of it may be, because that's really what happened, that you stop the GATT and you move to the WTO. What about stopping the WTO and you move to something else? I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I would ask the speakers to, in their second intervention, to look at the chat and look at the questions that we have in the chat, and see whether as part of their second intervention they could address some of those questions. But with that, I want to hand it over to Anthea to talk a bit more about how we can relate some of the Western narratives to narratives in China specifically.
I wanted to thank you. I wanted to pick up, there have been some fantastic comments about perspectives from around the globe, particularly from India and also from Africa. And I think for us, one of the things that we really learned in doing this book is the importance of looking at narratives beyond the Western narratives and how sometimes these were similar and sometimes these were different. And because there didn't end up being a Chinese speaker on this, this one, we wanted to share at least what we had seen when we looked further afield to China. But to do that, let me just say, there's sort of another way to kind of think about these narratives that may sort of help us think about what are some of the different moving blocks. And Nicholas and I call this the sort of game, not of noughts and crosses, but of hockey sticks and crosses. So here are the different narratives that we had put out. And the way we could talk about those hockey stick crosses is that some are defined by hockey sticks. And so here, for example, you have the extraordinary economic growth that we saw after the Industrial Revolution and with trade and technology. And this is something that's very reminiscent of these of what you see in the establishment narrative. But we also see a hockey stick coming, and a lot of people talk about COP26, this is another hockey stick we see coming, which is just as the same stage as we've had this hockey stick of economic growth, we've also seen this hockey stick exponential growth of the carbon emissions, and that's caused many problems around the world and very differential effects about which countries have done it as well. So we see both the top and bottom of the cube having exponentials of growth or carbon emissions, whereas what we see happening on the middle level are what we would think of as crosses. So on the left, you can think about both the left-wing and the populist narrative and the corporate power narrative, in essence, are very concerned about inequality. And so in the West, you often see that represented by, for example, this graph where you see the bottom 50% share of income going down and the top 1% going up. So you see this cross rather than a hockey stick. And we see something similar when you look on the more right-wing narrative. So if you take the right-wing populist narrative and the geoeconomic narrative, they're often also about crosses, but instead of about classes, they're often about countries. And so, for example, you would see quite often associated with the geoeconomic narrative, this kind of a cross, which is the share of the US economy going down of the world and the share of the China one going up. And so one question that we had as we looked at narratives around the world is we definitely found that there were narratives outside the West that were not well represented in the Western debate. And I think we've heard two of those that we also identify in the book, but I think we've heard them very clearly on this meeting. One was the neo-colonial narrative, which is that really that this is, don't be crying for the Western states that now feel like they're pushing back. They're the ones that through colonialization and then through their companies have really exploited the non-Western states in an incredible way. And you definitely hear that narrative much more strongly, I think, outside the West than in the Western debates. And we also hear the narrative, and Bettina also, I think, captured this well, which is kind of a left behind narrative, which is that there are some countries that haven't got on this globalization bandwagon, and what are we going to do with those? But the reason we wanted to highlight China here is I think China's a really interesting example about how you see different parts of a country embodying actually many different narratives. So there's not one African narrative or one Indian narrative or one Chinese narrative. You see different narratives coming to the fore from different groups. So for example, if you look at the Chinese debates on this, you can really see that one of the huge arguments that China has made, and which many developing states have made around the world, is that what we've seen in this period of economic globalization has been a massive reduction in poverty around the world. And actually, if you break that down a bit more, and Bettina, this also goes to your point, that huge reduction in poverty, which is something that President Xi likes to talk about in China when he goes to Davos and those sort of places, it's been very disproportionately in South Asia and East Asia. And actually in Africa, the number in poverty in absolute terms have actually gone up. But you can see this sort of very positive narrative about getting out of poverty coming from China in some forums. You can also see that as China has developed economically, it has started to be much more concerned about income inequality. And so we're seeing now with the common prosperity drive, but also with the desire to pull back big tech, this is something that we're seeing in the Western states, but we're also seeing some of the similar movements happening now in China in various ways. So we see similarity there. But what we often see when we look at the more right-wing populist or geoeconomic narratives is we often see kind of the same narrative, but told from the other side. So for example, instead of the communities being left behind and how terrible that is, you have your Asia Rising narratives, which are about the amazing cities that have been built in this era in Asia. And instead of having the geoeconomic narrative of, China as this threat and it's going to take over the world and technological advances, what we have is what we think of as kind of an against Western hegemony narrative. And here you actually see often a real association between China and Russia, where they're really pushing back against this kind of Western liberal democratic approach, this idea that one size fits all. And we see that pushback in many spheres in the cyber sphere, but we're also increasingly seeing that pushback in the economic sphere as well. And this particular perspective would look at, for example, the securitization of the concern about companies like Huawei and say, this isn't really about security. This is about you trying to hold us down and hold back our development. And you're just using the security as a guise for that. And finally, what we would also see from China is a real sort of sense that in many ways, China is stepping up to provide some of the global goods for the world. So China, through vaccines or through the Belt and Road Initiative or through these various other ways, are providing global public goods that help with things like pandemics or help with things like infrastructure. And this just gives you a bit of a sense of the sort of kaleidoscopic thing that we see when we look at narratives from different places. And I guess one of our entreaties to everyone is the importance of looking through different eyes. Joost has spoken about we need to have the facts. And yes, there is a really important role in these debates for facts. But often what we found in the different narratives is that they were highlighting different facts. They were changing the unit of analysis or changing the perspective and highlighting something that we actually wanted to find facts about, like what was the income distribution effect in particular states? How did it affect cities versus countries? How has it played out in Africa? And why is that different to what we see in other places? And so I guess we would just end by saying there that I think if you want to move forward in these sorts of ways, one of the first things that we need to do is be much more conscious of how this looks different to different people, different classes, different countries, to start to bring together those kaleidoscopic views to try and work out what could be used your clearinghouse going forward or a new narrative coming to the fore.
Thank you very much, Anthea. Abhijit, do you want to go next?
Thank you. I will just focus on one broad point, the role of narratives and the quest for market access. One of the questions posed to me was, how is EU's trade policy on chemicals and waste being viewed in India? That's part of the larger narrative of trade and sustainability. Certainly, there's no doubt that all countries, no exceptions here, all countries have to do their bit to mitigate problems caused by climate change. But having said that, countries also need to make sure that greening of their economies have to go hand in hand with creating incomes, creating jobs through producing green technology, green products. Now, the problem with the sustainability narrative is that it blocks one avenue for economic development for developing countries. Let's look at the narrative on pandemic. Yes, it's good to have a WTO response to pandemic, but should countries really be eliminating tariffs on products like cut flowers and alcoholic beverages to fight pandemic? that precisely is a proposal, is part of a proposal made by a couple of countries last year in their endeavor to fight the pandemic. Clearly, the pandemic was being used as a guise for extracting market access concessions. Similarly, the narrative on trade and MSMEs and trade and gender. Yes, all of us have to make sure that gender empowerment happens. But look closely at what is there. You will certainly get a sense that it's also about goading countries into joining government procurement agreement or lowering tariffs. When it comes to MSMEs, it's about more about commitments on financial services and regulatory coherence. So my very limited surmise is that developing countries need to be very careful about the narratives that are built. They need to recognize precisely what are the market access concessions that are being sought from them through these multiple narratives that are floating at the multilateral trading system. And one final point, I'm not at all pessimistic about the fate of the WTO. The goose that lays golden eggs cannot be killed at all. And given the power asymmetry at the negotiating table, I'm pretty sure that MC12, whenever it takes place, will launch a very comprehensive set of negotiations. These will not be called negotiations. These will be called work plans, action plans, focus discussions, whatever. And multilateralism is not going anywhere too soon. Of course, it might be called some other organization, but the essence of the rules will continue. I'm going to stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Bettina, do you want to address some of the questions or just add your full thoughts?
Yes, I just want to say what an honor to be surrounded by such brilliance. I mean, this is really one of probably my favorite conversations this year, to be honest, because you're forcing me to think things at a philosophical level rather than, trying to see how we can, fix this and fix that. I really, I'm so happy to hear, Anki, that you also looked at China, because of course, you cannot ignore the Western hegemony narrative. And this, by the way, is where the West is likely to lose Africa, right? Because of the influence of China, because of the attractive option that China presents as a big partner that doesn't scrutinize too closely certain things. I will stop there. I don't want to go beyond that. But I will also say that I think there's also potential. And I had this wonderful conversation, Professor Das, with Shashish Tharoor, who's one of my favorite thinkers and one of my favorite Indians, one of my favorite diplomats, one of my favorite writers. It's a literary festival in Berlin. And I said, look, we need to stop having this conversation about the West with the West, always locating ourselves back to colonialism and so on. Yes, we understand, we know where we are, it's done. Now we talk about solutions, how we create our own power blocks. And I would love to have a triple axis made of Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Think of what that could mean, negotiating together, pushing together, because we have so much in common in terms of history, we have so much in common in terms of interest. And also I can tell you that African women are with Brazil when it comes to the hair, that Brazilian hair, and also with India when it comes to the hair. And our leaders are obviously with China for obvious reasons. Our doctors, our healthcare professionals are with India. So what's happening with the emergence of the economies of Latin America, India, and so on is that they're presenting other options for African countries. They're presenting other opportunities, not only to work, but also for partnership, for investment, and so on. So I think that's an important emphasis to say that it's not, for Africa, it's not just about pushing back against the West. It's also about finding connections based, as you said so well, on national interest, and we are learning from the Americans, Joost. We're learning that there are no permanent friends, there are only permanent interests, right? And I have to say also that I want to echo what Professor Das just said, which is to say that the WTO is indeed the goose that laid the golden egg. It is the perfection of a free trade area. It is the multilateral perfection of that idea. So everything we're doing here at the AFCFTA, a lot of it is inspired, especially on dispute settlement, is almost copy and paste from the DSU. A lot of it is inspired because just because we may be disenchanted with the WTO, with negotiations, with outcomes, doesn't mean that we are going to ignore international best practice. It's written into our treaty. We have to, where it exists, we have to follow international best practice from those institutions where African countries are members. So absolutely, we will still continue to engage with the WTO. We will still continue to steal from the WTO because, you know, the best ideas are stolen. We will still continue to, you know, engage with all developing countries around the world, including China, and we'll still even continue to engage with the West, but it can no longer be just on Western terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bettina. Joost, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, in response to a couple of the questions. So Johanna was asking whether this idea of a transactional clearinghouse, whether that could go hand in hand with a rules-based system. I would say absolutely. The whole point is if there's to be a clearinghouse, it's also to check certain basic principles, certain basic multilateral principles. But as Rafael is saying in his question, I think being a clearinghouse needs to be accepting also multiple speed and variable geometry. Or variable geometry also in the sense of what Mahesh in his or her question was pointing out. You could have some deals that are subject to dispute settlement, others that are almost soft law. My TBT example that I gave you, that is more in the form of soft law. There were questions also on consensus, and I'm with Kenneth that in the 1990s, of course, there was never absolute consensus. And the Uruguay round was hard fought and a really amazing negotiation, but at least there was an underlying common narrative prevailing at that sense, at least amongst the elites of this Washington consensus. Of course, when other questions are asking more about, okay, what do you mean with consensus? And then of course we get into the meaning of consensus when it comes to making decisions, not the narratives. And there I think, as I was saying, to me, national interest is really important. And I don't think any country wants to do anything that is imposed on it. You have to have consent before you agree to new rules. But to require consent to impose vetoes for countries to go multiple speed, to me, that's a really tight constraint. Even within the EU, we have multiple speeds, and the EU is a collection of relatively like-minded countries. There's a final question on how could we bring in civil society business? Honestly, when I say this is not to be nice to my NGO friends or so, it's really to make the organization work, to make it relevant, to give it ideas. And you can't just do it the way the WTO does it, to organize a WTO public forum and let everyone talk a bit and then close the shop again and go back to diplomatic discussions, or to invite a couple of like-minded businesses to sit in a business dialogue. I mean, this is not serious. You have to structure this. And I don't know whether the EU model of very organized stakeholder committees is the best one, but this is really not a fig leaf or some kind of PR exercise. It's a method to make your work relevant, to co-opt it amongst a broader segment of people, to find better solutions, to make sure that implementation can actually happen. So, but in the WTO, compared to all other international organizations, they are light years behind. And somehow there's still this belief of member-driven in the sense of Geneva-based diplomats doing the work. There's a belief that will do the trick, but it won't. Thank you.
We have 2 minutes for final intervention. Anthea, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, just in response to what Joost was saying. So one thing that I'd be just curious to hear you reflect on is, in the investment space, you've used the idea of emergent and evolutionary approaches as a way to sort of understand the development, but also potentially the reform of that system. And it seems to me that in a way, what you're sort of saying here is that this one has got stuck and has been fractured, and we need to start an emergent and evolutionary approach again, that starts with some of the lower hanging fruit in much more experimental evolutionary ways and tries to build up a new sort of set of momentum in a different way. And so I was wondering if you could connect your thinking in trade to your thinking in investment.
Yes, do you want to respond?
No, I think the trade regime, as I said at the start of my remarks, the trade regime is much broader than the WTO, and there's a massive amount of tinkering going on, changes in regional trade agreements, autonomous instruments, unilateral instruments, domestic trade policy. It's really exciting. There's so much happening, but you're right that somehow at the WTO, even the incremental change, the small changes seem to be very difficult. And at some point, either, as Professor Das was saying, perhaps it will unblock at some point, but if it doesn't for much longer, then I think we have to consider the idea of letting it be and then start from a different model. Otherwise, it will become completely irrelevant. And I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, from Bob Lighthizer to the Indian trade minister, is that we need something like the WTO. If it wouldn't exist, it would have to be invented. It is the thing laying the golden eggs, and it should be there. But the question is, should it still be called the WTO if nothing moves in a couple of years? But Anthony, you're absolutely right. That's why I said the action is in Brussels and Washington, not Geneva, because the trade regime is changing tremendously. And that's where the action is, and it's really exciting. But somehow the WTO is falling behind, really because of its very rigid structure.
It brings us to the end of our discussion. All that remains for me is to thank all our speakers so much for their thoughts. I thought it was very provocative and inspiring discussions. And I'm sure that many of these conversations are going to continue throughout the 3 days of the hub. So please stick around for the other sessions, and look forward to many more discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.